So I'll introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth Williams, if you don't know me. And I've been doing employee communications for a great number of years, but I have to say that nothing quite compares to this particular situation. I'm working with a number of clients, mostly big companies, and it has been a pretty intense 4 weeks. And I keep waiting for it to slow down, but it just isn't. So I'll be sharing some of the observations I've seen from my clients and a few things that I have learned mostly the hard way over the past month. And I'll ask Andrew to introduce himself.
And I'm Andrew Brown. For several years as well, I've been helping companies deal with company-wide employee communications and communications crises, things like union actions, broad-based outages and deaths on site. But as Elizabeth said, nothing quite like this. Also, in addition to helping clients, spent nearly 50 hours in crisis communications webinars over the last couple of weeks to see what, if any, strategies or tactics are helping businesses through the confusion and anxiety caused by COVID-19.
Andrew, who has survived a number of really less than ideal webinars over the past few weeks, has found them wanting. And so today we are making a promise to you that we're going to give you actions you can go home and do, or go back to the work and do this afternoon to get a little more order and a little less chaos, and prepare for what are doubtless going to be some pretty crazy days ahead. So throughout, just chime in with the chat. Just hover at the bottom, you'll see a chat come up, and we will do our best to answer all your questions. So one thing is for sure, this is not our great-granddaddy's epidemic. This is not the Spanish flu, and we are in a very different place. We've got always-on news. We've got employees who have, the news crawl going on the bottom of their screens all day long, and it's freaking them out. We have rampant misinformation. You've probably seen some of the crazy cures and things like that. And this creates new sources of trust, which is good, but it also creates this sort of constant battle to stay ahead of misinformation or rumor or any of that. And of course, the more information you have, it's a bit like dim sum, the more you want. And so we've got employees sort of gobbling up good information, bad information, who knows what information. Social media certainly isn't helping either, because now it's very easy to amplify good news and bad news, and good opinion and bad opinion. One thing is for sure, you can't out-communicate a pandemic. There are some situations where we can try to out-communicate something, we can get in front of it, but I think a pandemic, the temptation is to yell at it, and to yell at employees, and to yell at clients, and really we're never going to out-communicate this thing. So the thing that we really have to do is figure out how to communicate through it. One thing that is not working in our favor is that prior to this pandemic, only 8% of corporate communications leaders believed they had the skill set on their teams that they needed. Now, I'm going to go ahead and suggest that in a pandemic, a lot of the skill sets we're looking for are the real basic ones, right? We need people who can write. We need people who can strategize. We need people who can work with executives versus we need people who can write code. But it's, it's troubling, to say the least, that many corporate communications teams weren't feeling great to begin with. And now they're tasked with this enormous job of keeping people together through an unprecedented and scary time. And so Andrew's going to offer us some interesting frameworks that may help us move through this and maybe take that confidence number from 8% at least to the single digits. So I will turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So in reviewing a slew of well-meaning internal communications webinars and materials, it's really easy to be lured into thinking that everything is good because the same ground keeps being covered. The problem is that there are some really dangerous assumptions being made throughout. For example, back up, Elizabeth. Yeah, thanks. You may have left many webinars believing that if you just get the perfect message, the world will be right again. It's that silver bullet approach. However, placing so much emphasis on the message overlooks that, one, you need a reliable and robust process for developing messages. 2, you need processes for communicating. 3, you need to listen. And ultimately, you need communication skills throughout your organization. So, another dangerous assumption is that there's a bad case of what I call everyone is. In other words, the assumption is that that your employees are just one single uniform audience. You know, everyone is at a desk. Everyone is English speaking. Everyone is on reliable technology. And that assumption that everyone comes to cope with the crisis in the same ways and on the same timetable is also there. And the truth is that's not the case. Finally, in times of crisis, there's the assumption that the organization is the parent. It sounds comforting, but the truth is that successful employee communications cannot be left at the foot of even the most well-intentioned executive team. Not all leaders have the availability, the willingness, or the skills to understand what is important to employees and consistently deliver meaningful communications. Furthermore, leaders may lack credibility within their employees, and that's something we'll touch on a little later. Now, of course, we're here today because employers do play a role in effective employee communications. In fact, according to Edelman's 2020 Trust Barometer, trust in employers is only lower than that of formal health authorities. So we're going to be very real today to the point where it hurts. Earth-shattering crises like the health crisis brought on by COVID-19 blindside us because they originate and build up steam from factors external to our business. But for employee communications to be effective, we have to do more than make sense of the turmoil and the impact on our business operations. Actually, we have to acknowledge, understand, and work with that emotional disruption employees are feeling, and acknowledge that cognitive limitations that we as human beings have during times of ongoing uncertainty and fear. So we're going to have a 6-stage diagnostic that layers external forces with emotional and cognitive realities. And this framework will help you identify where you are today and reveals where you're going to come up next. The first stage is when we recognize warning signs that something could have an impact on our business and our employees. This was the December, January timeframe for COVID-19. The second stage, stranger at the door, is when we devote time and resources to planning for the crisis. We don't have all the answers at this stage, but we know that employees are curious about it. It's like having a song get stuck in your head and you can't quite shake it. You know you're going to have to do something because it's just not going to go away. For the COVID crisis, many organizations entered the next stage. Shit hits the fan the week of March the 9th. This is when it feels like that song in the ear is amped up to 11 and there's simply no escaping it. It's not a distraction, it's there, it's loud, and it's there all the time. This is where operations and communications come together to try to help wrap our heads around the impact of the crisis and minimize the trauma it creates. The intensity of the stage is really determined by how unpredictable the crisis is, the severity of the impact, the work completed at those earlier 2 stages, and of course the ability of employees and organizations to cope with the crisis. The next stage, the new normal, arrives when old routines are adjusted to deal with the crisis. The end of the tunnel arrives when things are looking up and triumphs over how an organization is dealing with it can actually be declared. Hey, look at that, we've had some success. Finally, we get to the moving on stage. The reality is that after a significant change like a merger, an acquisition, rolling out new technologies, can sometimes take years. So in the case of COVID-19, I think it's fair to say that moving on stage will likely linger. So that's what we go through as an organization, but what happens to each of our employees and executives? On an individual level, well, you may be familiar with Kubler-Ross's way of describing what happens when each of us experience grief. It turns out that when dealing with significant change like a health crisis, employees make their way through some very predictable stages. Just keep in mind that while these stages are predictable, people occasionally slide back and forth, particularly when new information is presented, and there aren't any constants. So you can't expect people to be in one stage just for X number of hours and that, or days or weeks, and someone else is going to act the same way. So there is some variation. The first stage is shock. This is when there is disbelief that the event has occurred. Think back to early March. The next stage is denial. So not only are employees off their game, they're in disbelief. In fact, they're not sure what to believe. So what do humans do when our routines are being disrupted? We fight or we take flight. And when employees are in denial, they are doing both. We go from denial to frustration. That often takes the form of anger, sometimes railing at the crisis itself, at the way it's being dealt with within an organization, or sometimes at things completely unrelated, like familiar points of contention. All of us go through some degree of depression, low mood, low energy, and a feeling of helplessness takes over. The biggest communications error here is to ignore, blame, or ostracize people who are depressed, dismissing them as potential obstacles. Rather, that depression must be acknowledged. And when we emerge from depression, we enter a stage of experimentation. We're feeling the waters emotionally. We're coming to grips with the change and the impact that we are facing. From a communications perspective, the important thing to do is to recognize the early signs of acceptance and make the benefits of adopting that change clear. So the final two stages, decision and integration, is when we start to accept the new reality with all its new challenges and flaws. Employees decide how to work in a new situation. They may not like it, but the decision to acknowledge that a new reality is in place provides some emotional stability and certainly less anxiety. So, how are things different with COVID-19? Well, not only are employees proceeding through these stages, but today's situation is unusually extreme. Each of those emotional states are more severe because people feel as if their very lives and those of their loved ones are at stake. So this is not business as usual. We're also anticipating grief, that is, worrying about what could happen next. This occurs when what comes next is so uncertain or when there is no end in sight. Sound familiar? The COVID-19 crisis has both of these characteristics. And finally, employees can find themselves calling into question whether the tasks, jobs, and or organizations have meaning. I mean, think about it. Our government has relegated the lion's share of business to non-essential. So now we know the stages of crisis, and we understand how, as people, we emotionally process crises. As such, we have a better foundation for setting some ground rules for how, what, and when to communicate with our leaders, our colleagues, and our teammates. So let's just take a moment and see what that looks like at each stage of the COVID-19 crisis. But we're going to add one more layer to our framework, and that's our cognitive ability to process information. So let's turn our attention to the first stage of the crisis to see what this framework looks like. I'm going to give you a second to digest that, because this is at the early stage. And at the early stage, our brain was quite capable of processing information at our average grade level, AGL. And we were rational beings. We weren't overly affected by emotions. We were curious and not neutral. And when hearing about COVID-19, there could have been a willingness to accept change. And at that time, the focus really from a communication standpoint is identifying key stakeholders, understanding potential risks, listening for dressing rumors. And from an organization standpoint, the messages are rather straightforward. You know what? We're ahead of it. We're watching. We'll let you know. Well, that's with people being rational. Now we're going to turn our attention to the stages where most everyone is right now and what's coming next. Let's talk about the shit hits the fan stage of crisis. At this stage, we do not hear information because we are juggling multiple facts. In fact, we process information on average 4 grade levels lower than what we are usually able to process. Furthermore, we don't remember as much information or detail as we normally would. As a result, we tend to hold on tightly to the very first thing we hear. That means we're far more prone to misinterpreting information or accepting incomplete information. And of course, that's why rumors start at this time and take root. Remember the shock we felt sort of the week of March 9th? That's the emotional state our employees are in when the shit hits the fan. Just when things are the most chaotic, that's when humans struggle with fight and flight. People's patience is reduced. We become prickly, skeptical, more prone to antagonistic. And not surprisingly, during this stage, we as humans find it very difficult to accept change. Rather, we look for comfort in old habits and routines, even bad habits. And of course, during the stage, despite all the turmoil, our focus should be on balancing our desire to push communication out with listening, acknowledging people's limitations and their discomfort. Messages need to be simple, consistent, and delivered quickly from a credible source. But we need to make sure that we enable, encourage, and structure conversations. Organizational messages like we're strong, we survive, and here's what you need to do are really key. But keep in mind, they're going to fall on deaf ears if our emotional distress is not acknowledged and our need for transparency is denied. Well, if you've come through the shit hits the fan, many kudos to you and your team. The new normal still has its challenges for communicating with employees, though. Our ability to process, given the undercurrent of ongoing anxiety and uncertainty, means that we as humans are still not firing on all engines. That means the messages we convey and the communication skills we draw upon are going to be less than perfect. The reality is compounded by the fact that our teammates, leaders, and colleagues are all feeling a combination of frustration and depression. What does that mean as far as accepting changes? Well, we can adopt new behaviors, but we really haven't bought in. And we're still looking for comfort that comes with things that are familiar. Our communications focus should be on to help people let go of old routines. In other words, it's a change management process where the stakes are higher, the time frames are shorter, and the capacity of the team to embrace change is lower than usual. As far as messages to send, well, and these have got to be through words and behaviors, they should emphasize that we will survive, and we are indeed listening to you.
Great. Are there any questions before we move on to the next section? All right, well, let's dive in then. We've been out there now for a month. It feels like a lot longer, and some stuff is actually working. And I would say that, looking at my clients in larger organizations, they are doing the good work they need to do to remove the barriers that would get in their way. So, where corporate communications often takes a very long and torturous route through approvals, I'm certainly seeing that we're able to execute a lot faster than we would in normal circumstances. We're fussing a lot less, and we're willing to be, a little less than perfect to get out the door. We're pushing more stuff to the front line directly, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing, as a sort of double-edged sword. And one of the really encouraging thing is we're opening the gates to our gardens a little bit, and we'll see an example of that from the University of Alberta in a minute. And by that I mean, we as organizations tend to have kind of, closed systems. So we've got our VPN and we've got our email and we've got maybe our intranet, and, and everything has to kind of happen within that. And what we're learning as we go out is that, to Andrew's point, not everyone sits at a desk in a workstation. We have people who have no desks. We have people whose interaction with our organizations is on a phone. And we're having to learn to open the gates a little bit and perhaps err on the side of maybe too wide open a gate in order to make sure that people have access. We're getting over our production standards. So good enough is good enough, right? It may not be perfect. I have personally been designing posters and things, and I am not someone who should design posters, but it's more important that we give people information than it's beautiful. And I'm noticing more and more that the messaging, which at the beginning of the crisis, when the shit was hitting the fan, it was very much around, here's what you have to do, and here's what we're doing. And now I'm noticing that we've got to shift to more employee-centric messages. So we're celebrating the employees who are still coming out to work. We're messaging to make sure that people who are working from home are doing okay, are engaged, are managing stress and anxiety, and that's good. And we're seeing more executives stepping up into the spotlight. So Galen Weston rocking his sweater vest there. I personally, I think they've done a really good job of putting Galen Weston out in front as the voice of Loblaws, both to his employees, but also to his customers. And if you're on the mailing list that comes with the Optimum card, I think you start seeing a lot of the transparency that these CEOs are showing. So they're saying, here's what we're telling our employees, and here's what we're telling our customers. And so that wall that's usually between them is blurring, and many executives are doing a really, really good job. Of course, not all executives are doing a really good job. This is the music executive David Geffen, who tweeted that he was celebrating his isolation in the Grenadines on his giant yacht. So we're still getting a little bit of tone-deaf executive play, but I think in general, most of them are stepping up and recognizing that this is really critical work. This is what the role of the executive is, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Now, that said, there are still some challenges that persist. We've got communications departments that were never really built to meet the demand that's being placed on them, just in terms of stuff to go out. We have an awful lot of people with not quite enough to do, and so sort of like a border collie needs something to herd, and if it doesn't, it eats your couch. We have a lot of executives and very senior people who have gone from 80-hour weeks to not very much on their plates, and many of these people then revert to what I call the comma police. And so in an genuine effort to add value, they're actually slowing stuff down, either by being really, really picky about things, or by trying to create processes in a situation where perhaps process definition isn't really what we need. And I think there's those of us in communications, and I think there's some HR people on the phone too, right? Executives don't always have that much visibility into how we do things, how we get messages out the door. And so there's still, I'm seeing a lot of tension and challenge between, executives wanting something out by 9 a.m. in 6 languages, and not really understanding that, there's an awful lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to push stuff out the door. One of the things that I would advise is McKinsey. If you're not, don't subscribe to them, get on their list. McKinsey is publishing really, really, really good guidance for executives. In particular, one of the things that they've published is sort of an outline of, take a breath. before you communicate. The urgency is not quite as much as it was back in March the 9th when it started hitting the fan. So we can take a breath and think a little more strategically and a little more intentionally. We can involve a few more people now that we're not having to execute and catch up. You know, and we can build these networks of teams, and that's what this this illustration is. And what's interesting to me is nowhere in this action team do I see human resources or internal communications. But the concept, this idea of creating teams of teams, we're seeing that work, and we're seeing that as a way to control some of the process paralysis that can go on. And, you know, when we empower the leaders that we need, the ones who have good character and judgment, you know, we can really communicate well through this. One of the other things we're seeing is there are some risks with all of this. And so one of the big risks we're seeing is output versus outcome, right? And so a lot of communications and HR teams they're just cranking stuff out. And, you know, that's good. And for the first few weeks when it was hitting the fan, we had a lot of catching up to do, didn't we? We had to communicate hygiene and distancing, and, you know, every day we had a new message from the Prime Minister about something, and we were really catching up. And now that we're sort of settling into the new normal, and I saw in our poll that everybody who voted feels like they're in the new normal, we probably have to start thinking a little less about just cranking things out and a little more about what is the outcome we want, right? So, you know, we need to be intentional. It's not just enough to shove a message out the door. We also want to make sure that we're driving the right behaviors that we want. So we've got people washing their hands, but what else do we need them to do? I've got a good example. One of my clients was having a lot of issues with the physical distancing in their break rooms. So everybody coming in for break from the shop floor, and what do you do when you're trying to keep 6 feet apart and still microwave your macaroni? And so they actually, the site turned it over to their employees and said, how do we do this? How do we have lunch and breaks together without, you know, being too close? And they came up with some really great, they rearranged the cafeterias, and they came up with some great rules around how to microwave your lunch and manage the microwaves without everybody getting too close. So sometimes the behaviors don't need to come from on high. Sometimes we just need to get out of our own way. I think one of the other things I worry that we're missing is measurement, right? So communicators measure everything all the time. And so I think it's important now that we're through the fan to start doing those pulse surveys and make sure those messages are getting to the people we need them to get to, and that the behaviors we're trying to change are changing, because we don't lose our obligation to be inclusive just because we've got a pandemic on our hands. And we need to make sure too that we're keeping an eye on alignment with our values, because where we're communicating things that aren't really around our values, we start seeing things like employee activism. So there's an activism risk. And so we want to keep making sure that that we don't have that. So for example, I think 2 weeks ago, some people walked out of an Amazon warehouse because they didn't feel that it was safe. Recently, we had a nurse in London, I think last week, went on Facebook to say, you know, her neighbors were making her masks because there weren't enough at the hospital. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but as an organization, we don't always want what's going on inside to be played out outside. And of course, with social media, that's very possible. Just this week, Detroit Transit had to deal with a bus driver who last week had made a video about a lady coughing on his bus, contracted the COVID-19 virus, and then died. And that all played out very publicly on YouTube. So we need to make sure that we're watching our social media monitoring. So one of the actions I would say is do your pulse surveys, look for ways for your executives to give authentic messaging, watch for any risks of employee activism, particularly if you're an essential business where you're asking people, possibly hourly people, to take the risk of coming to work. So we need to make sure that we're not creating a situation where they feel that they need to talk to their employers in social media. So let's talk about what CEOs communicate. So CEOs have the job basically of answering the question of what should we do and why do we do it. And the three things that they're really in charge of communicating is trust, they need to own tragedy, and they need to share triumph. And so trust is really an output of the stuff that Andrew was talking about. Reassurance, making sure that people know that the organization's on it, they have it, they know what they're doing. The gratitude, and I think that's what we're starting to see now with this employee-centric messaging. I'm seeing a lot of CEOs thanking their employees for coming in and for doing the work and for sticking with it. And also that confidence, right? That's what CEOs are all about. It's all about the confidence. And that all of those three things build that trust. When it comes to tragedy, and I certainly hope that your organizations don't face this, but when it comes to tragedy, whether it's having to shut down an organization, lay off a bunch of people, or mourn the loss of a colleague, that's really the thing that we ask our CEOs to own, and whether they like it or not. And tragedy is owned by the CEO, but triumph, so as we start to come through to the end, the triumph is actually a team sport. And we want to make sure that our CEOs are sharing any tiny victories, and particularly as we come out the end of it, that we want to be seen to be sharing all of the work that went on, and that's part of that gratitude thing. I would say for exemplars, the CEO of Home Depot has been fantastic, and he's been very visibly on the floor. He's been very visibly, well, not shoulder to shoulder, but 6 feet away from other employees. But he's been quite visible about it. And one of the things that that we know that social media is very important. 80% of employees expect to hear from their CEOs on social media during a crisis, and so we've got some good examples. So this is the chairman of ADNOC, and so he's on every day on LinkedIn and communicating with his clients and with his customers there. This is the president of Verizon, so he does a daily webcast on Twitter Live to reach his employees, but of course because it's on Twitter, other people can watch too. So it's that interesting opening of the gate between inside voice and outside voice. This is Chris Kempczinski at McDonald's. He uses Instagram to communicate with his employees and with his customers. I think it's important that you have your CEOs on at least one social media platform, depending on what kind of business you have. All right, so what should the other executives be doing? We talked about all dog, no sheep. And so what we've got is we've got a lot of executives who have, gone from being on planes and in meetings back to back, 12 and 13 hours a day, to having very little to do. And so we want to make sure that we're not leaving them up to their own devices to figure that out, because it probably won't be productive. And so one of the things that I've been certainly working with senior leaders at my client organizations is getting them out there as reinforcers of the CEO messages. So amplifying those messages into their own divisions, making them more relevant in their own divisions. They are fantastic people to deploy at problems because you've got senior experienced people and you can get them to solve problems. So whether it's a supplier problem or a billing problem or a morale problem, these are the people we can really send into battle on that. I'm seeing as well an encouraging sign of bridge building. So, if you've got an organization with, let's say, some cultural fractures where certain groups aren't getting along, it's actually a great time to do a little bit of housekeeping on the back end and see if we can build some bridges. And particularly as well with suppliers. I don't know about your organizations, but certainly the ones I'm working with have a great dependence on certain suppliers now. And they're really turning to their executives to build up that relationship so that when we ask for help, we get it. Another great thing executives who are CEO can do is they're good at bad news. So not tragedy, but bad news. So, we're having to lay a few people off, or something has broken, or something that we were hoping would happen isn't happening. And so I would tend to give to those executives those little bad news things. So we don't want our CEO to be, the voice of doom, constantly going, oh, and this other thing happened, and this is terrible. We want to sort of spread that misery out a little bit among all of the executive team. And of course, the big thing we need our executives to do is listening. And this is so important. And I think it's probably, and we always say in a crisis, the first casualty is coherence. And I would argue that the close second is listening. We're so busy trying to push information out, we sometimes forget to shut up and hear what the front line and what our frontline managers are saying. So I would deploy our executives on virtual listening tours right now. That would be, I think, the takeaway from this is get them on those conference calls and get them asking questions. You can also use, I have one organization, we use a thing called Slido, S-L-I-D-O, and it allows employees to post anonymous questions on a website. And then every couple of weeks, we get the CEO to address those questions on a webinar. So that's a simple way to listen. And it's not enough to listen, we have to be seen to be listening. All right, so let's move on. We love frontline managers at the Academy. We think they are about the best thing ever when it comes to communications. And their role really is, when the CEO is talking about what and how, or what and why, these are the people who are telling our employees when and how. What do we have to do, and when do we do it, and how do we do it? And the reason we love them is because they have trust. They are the most trusted source of information by far among employees. And of course, they have access, right? They're talking to our frontline employees every day, and they're listening to them. And we want to make sure that we're enabling these frontline managers to be the communication superstars they are. So one of the things that we recommend, and remember, some of these managers are actually 25 years old, and they're a crew shift leader at a coffee shop. So we're not necessarily talking about people with a ton of experience. So what we want to do is arm them with lots of facts. They need to be credible. We want to make sure that we're, in the absence of facts, that they're not making up stuff and then normalizing the BS, because that can happen as well. We want to give them a place of their own where they can go get resources. And you'll see on the right here, this is what the University of Alberta did. And it's interesting, this is a webpage anyone can go to. And they realized that, between contract and part-time and remote and adjunct faculty, they really didn't have a coherent way to reach out to all these frontline people within their walls. So they just started publishing it on their public website. And so now all of their leaders, regardless of role, regardless of seniority, can go in and get access to the materials they need. We occasionally need to smack them. We do occasionally need to make sure that they're actually delivering the information, that they're doing the listening, and that they're not making things up. And the way that we can make sure of that, of course, is measuring. And so I would advise, if you haven't yet done it, start putting out some pulse surveys to your frontline managers and ask them if they're feeling informed and confident as they try to communicate through this crisis with their employees. And I will pass it now back to Andrew.
Thank you. That's great. So remember that self-assessment that you, in theory, completed earlier, at least you received this morning? It's going to serve as your COVID-19 communications action plan for the next 30 days. It's coping with COVID-19. So based on the score you gave yourself, here's what you should be focusing on. If you see the scores on the left-hand column, if you're 0 to 10, really should probably be working on building a foundation for your crisis communications. And then there's some specific priorities, decision-making processes, infrastructure. If you find yourself scoring between 11 and 19, well, it's probably that you should be focusing on getting some more feet on the ground. So focus on frontline managers, personas, and listening. Again, I ask you to refer back to that to that assessment, because not only is it a self-assessment, but the actions there can help direct what your next 30 days is going to look like. If you happen to score between 20 to 26, well, for the next 30 days, focus on helping your executives addressing key issues and listening on a grander scale. And finally, if you've scored higher, chances are your team is burnt out. You and whoever is in charge of employee communications is burnt out. So show the loving to your comms team. So we've covered a lot today. So just a quick summarize and provide some actions. First, don't be content to thinking that there is uniformity. There is no single perfect message, a single leader, a single audience that all have the same concerns. Determine what stage you're at as far as the 6 stage of crises, and plan based on the stage, recognizing that employees also have emotional and cognitive abilities that are going to vary. Regularly identify and repeat those practices that are working for you. Assess the new risk exposures you are facing. And if you have time, plan out some scenarios. Of course, keep your CEO focused on trust, tragedy, and triumph, and being the chief listening officer. Focus other executives so that their inner shepherd energies help you rather than distract you. Work with frontline managers and listen to their insights. And finally, use the Fearless Communicators Coping Assessment to help you prepare for the next stage of the crisis.
The best way to get insights from frontline managers? That's an excellent question. Thank you for that. I think that the best way actually is to talk to them directly and to do a bit of listening. And so I would say, if you've got the opportunity to have some kind of a regular check-in with your frontline managers. That would be an excellent way to do it, whether it's a conference call or maybe a pulse survey if that's not available to you. So I think that that's probably your best way is we want to listen and get your executives out there too, right? Especially if you think there's an unusually quiet part of the business, you might want to deploy someone senior to go see what's going on. And then I have another question. What is involved and what is the focus of the 30 minutes of free consulting? Basically, we'll just listen. So you can ask us anything. If you just want to cry for 30 minutes, you can do that. But we're really there, we're trying to help organizations who maybe don't have the resources. So we can certainly help you with best practices. We can dig up some research. We can review your plan and give you some feedback. We can help you with your CEO messaging. So really, we're here to help. So, reach out to us separately, and we will do whatever we can to help you through this, because it's truly unprecedented, and it's truly, it's up to communicators and HR people to help get our employees through this.